Good afternoon, Sioux Falls. Welcome to the Land Use Committee of the Sioux Falls City Council. All of our members are present, and thank you for being here in the audience, along with the people out on TV land and on the internet. I would entertain, to start off, I'd entertain a motion to accept our minutes of March 17th, 2015.
Move to approve.
Second.
And all in favor, aye. Opposed, motion carries. We have two items on our agenda today. First one is Project T.R.I.M. Kelby Maris is going to give us a presentation, and welcome, Kelby.
Thank you. Good evening, City Council. Kelby Maris with Parks and Recreation. Here to visit with you about Project T.R.I.M. Project T.R.I.M. stands for Tree Raising Improvement Methods. It's a 5-year cyclic street tree trimming program designed to address the low-hanging branches over streets and sidewalks. This project, we began this project in 2005. We're almost our second way all the way around the city, doing one section of town every year. It takes us 5 years to get all the way around the city. We did take out, or did not do Project T.R.I.M. in 2013 due to the ice storm. It is important to note that during Project T.R.I.M. we are surveying both trees in the public right-of-way and on private property that impact the right-of-way. And all of those trees are inspected and brought into compliance with city ordinance. Just to give you a graphic on how the forestry districts and the areas within those districts line up, the map here shows you where we are for 2015 and going through the next 5 years. Each of the forestry districts are broken into 3 areas that we do inspect once every 5 years. And though we have selected the times of year in which we do Project T.R.I.M. to coincide with good times in which to trim trees. In 2014, we surveyed over 11,600 different properties for compliance. And since the inception of Project T.R.I.M., we've had a 97% compliance rate on the notices that we send out for those that are have trees that are in violation of the ordinance. Just to quickly run you through the steps of Project T.R.I.M. When we do our survey, it's a windshield survey that we do in one of our high rangers. I have 2 employees that drive down the street, and as they drive down the street, they notice a tree branch on a property that's out of compliance. They mark that property off as being out of compliance with the ordinance, and we move on from there. They're continuing to move down the street. This survey takes us about 3 days to complete, and during this survey, like I said, we're driving down the street, so we are not at that point determining exactly which tree is out of compliance. We just know that that property is out of compliance, that at least one tree on that property is out of compliance. From that point, we send a letter to the property owner with the due date, and on average, about 32% of the property surveying need trimming. In 2014, that was about 3,700 letters. The inspection, we do go back and inspect the properties after the due date, and if the trees are brought into compliance, Project T.R.I.M. is over for that property owner, and they are in compliance with our ordinance. If the property is not in compliance, we leave a door hanger or a note that lets them know that more trimming is needed. And on that note, it provides them with a whole lot more information as far as exactly what the height needs to be, where the tree is, which trees are out of compliance, and provides an extension for them also. Of the 3,700 letters that we sent out, 29% of those properties did need additional trimming after the original due date, which means that we put out about 1,100 notes for properties that needed additional trimming. Again, if we go back to after that extended due date and the property is into compliance, all the trees on that property are in compliance, the process is over for that property owner. If not, this is the 3rd time we've been back by the property. Forestry crew will do the trimming. And in 2014, we trimmed 140 properties that were completed by the forestry crew, which is about a little over 96% of the 3,700 original letters that were sent out. The ordinance clearing heights are established over streets and sidewalks, arterial streets and collector streets. Think 41st Street, Western Avenue. Clearance over those streets is 16 feet. Over all other streets and alleys, it's 12 feet, and then 10 feet over the sidewalks. Some of the vehicle heights that are used on all these streets that is important to get these tree branches up and out of the way of. Snow plows, of course, street sweepers, buses, graders that help do the snow removal, forestry bucket truck, which is the vehicles that we use to do the inspection, and then, of course, moving trucks, semis, delivery vehicles are up to 14 feet. Project TRIM is an ever-evolving project for us, and this diagram was recently brought into the program and sent out with those original letters, which really helps the property owners, gives them a visual as far as what tree branches do need to be removed, what should be addressed on those trees. The stuff on the graphic on the top for the young trees is really important because we used to get lots of questions from property owners. My tree's only 12 feet tall and you want me to trim every branch of the tree off up to 12 feet. No, we don't want you to do that. We just need all the branches out of the branch-free zones over the sidewalk and over the street. So we think this graphic has been extremely helpful in the project TRIM. To give a little bit of history here on how things were before Project TRIM, we averaged about 450 tree complaints for low-hanging branches every year. In the 5 years after we began Project TRIM, after we'd made our way all the way around the city, we were down to just under 200, a decrease of about 56% in the number of complaints that we were receiving. I think it's also important to note that in that 10-year span, the population of the city of Sioux Falls grew from about 124,000 to about 154,000, or a 24% increase. So even though our city got considerably larger in those 10 years, we still had cut our number of complaints by more than half. Also, while we do Project TRIM, we do make sure that we survey all the city properties that are in that area that's being surveyed at that time. In 2014, 32 parks were in the Project TRIM area and were inspected for compliance and also trimmed to meet the code. Also, as we're doing our inspections, we do other city properties, libraries, fire stations, storm drainage areas, medians, etc., just to make sure that all city properties are also in compliance with our city ordinances. Currently, the cost of Project TRIM is about $31,000 annually, budgeted through the Parks and Recreation budget. An estimate that we've come up with the help of finance, to contract out the tree trimming using a lot of information that we gleaned from and contacts that we gleaned from the ice storm, would be an increase to the city budget of about $660,000 to contract out all the street tree trimming. And this would also keep us on this very important 5-year cycle of trimming the street trees around the city. If the trimming was to be completed by city crews, we estimate that the annual budget would need to increase about $580,000, and then a one-time startup cost of about $910,000 to provide the necessary equipment for the crews to complete the trimming. And again, this is anticipated to keep us on that 5-year trimming cycle. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Committee, any questions? Yes, Councilor Jameson.
So, Calby, you're in favor of that one-time purchase of $900,000 and having the city do it?
I'm actually in favor of continuing our practices at this point.
I know, it was supposed to be a joke. The question is on the growth of the city. You know, there's a lot of new areas in town and population, but those new growth areas have much smaller trees. So I think that wave of complaints may come back later, but that graph that you came up with, that picture, I think is very helpful. at least for people to see how to do it, what you really mean. You've made some strides in that. Anyway, I just wanted you to be aware that I think as years come due and those new growth areas start to mature, you're going to find yourself maybe a little fuller.
Right, and we do include those new growth areas as we, there are properties in this year in our first set of inspections in 2015 that we didn't inspect 5 years ago, or actually 6 years ago because of the ice storm, because it wasn't developed at that point. But we are inspecting those as well, so that we make sure that we're bringing those new places into compliance as well if those young trees need to be addressed.
Yes, Councilor Staggers.
Yes. I know there are some people that are not happy about this Project Trim because they have to put in their own financial resources to do this, and the city saves lots of money this way. You indicated maybe around $600,000 a year. This city saves money by forcing people to trim city trees. Is there any indication that people are just saying, especially in newly developed areas, I don't want to have a tree because I don't want to go through the hassle with it?
I'm not personally seeing that. I live in a newer area of town, and through my neighborhood there are a lot of trees that the property owners have planted in the right of way. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's that the city ordinance is curtailing tree planting at all. I think it's a tool to help us keep up the health of the urban forest, especially in the new areas as we continue to plant new trees.
Yeah, I don't think there's any. I think people want trees, but if the tree belongs to the city should take care of their own tree.
Well, a lot of the tree branches that are also addressed through Project Trim come from trees that are planted and live on private property that extend out into the right-of-way over the sidewalk and street as well. No,
I agree with you that those should be trimmed because those are private trees by private property owners. But then when you talk about the city trees, which is I shouldn't say most, but it's a lot of the trees, the city should be doing that.
Yeah, go ahead, Councilor Anderson.
Yeah, we want to talk about some of the numbers here that you were putting out to us here. 31,000 per year. That is just doing a certain area, is it not? Or is that the entire city that you're surveying?
No, that's doing 1/5 of the city.
That's 1/5. Now these other numbers here, the 659,000 for contract, is that for the entire city, or would that also be for the 1/5?
That is for 1/5 of the city.
1/5.
Each of these numbers would keep us on that, would be an annual cost to keep us on that 5-year trimming cycle.
Okay. And then right now, when we're doing Project Trim, we have 2 people in a truck that go around and check the heights of branches and things like that. How do they mark them? Like say if they find a yard that has a tree that is failing their test, do they mark those trees showing where at least a level that the homeowner needs to go to be in compliance?
No, not at that point to do, because like I said, we're driving down the street, and if we see, we just mark off that property. This property is out of compliance. We mark it off on a sheet that they have. It's got all the addresses in order as we're going down the street. They just highlight that address and continue on down the street. So they don't even, in this initial survey, they don't even leave the truck.
If I may?
Yes.
See, and that's where I think where we've seen most of the complaints is that homeowners will get the letter and there's no indication on what tree, maybe if they're, especially like they're on a corner, what tree was out of compliance, things like that. What are we doing in our letters to try to be more specific on what trees are out of compliance?
The letter does inform the property owner that not one of their trees was identified, that we have not identified which tree is out of compliance, and that this is a perfect time for them to inspect all of the trees on their property for needed maintenance. Not only making sure they're in compliance with city ordinance, but there's other maintenance that needs to be done to trees periodically as well. So our literature that we send out, the information that we provide, encourages them to look at all of the trees that would impact, trees and shrubs that could impact the right-of-way.
Okay, thank you.
Two things, Kelby. This diagram, trimming diagram, does that go out with the letter?
Yes, it does.
Okay, that would answer the question right there. I think with this going out with the letter, people should be able to go out and say, am I the diagram is very plain here. I think you got to be within the park area, and if it's above that 10 or 12 foot area, it's a larger tree, then you've got to be up to the 16 or 12 foot, depending on that. And they should be able to see that.
Well, that's what I was asking.
Yeah.
What is part of, if that's part of the letter, then that should have been
helps a lot,
stated at
doesn't
that time too,
Yeah,
so.
that helps a lot.
Yeah.
Kelby, to answer some of Councilor Stager's questions and concerns there about ownership of the trees, how many of those trees in the park area in the right-of-way does the city plant?
We don't have a program to plant any of those trees.
So those are all planted by the individual homeowners?
Right. Historically, there have been a couple of special situations in which the city has participated in replanting some of the trees that were removed as part of a project. But in 2014 and 2015, we don't have any projects or any mechanism to plant any trees in the right of way.
So we don't go around as a city and plant those trees just to get 50 years later to get a canopy effect
That's correct. We
in
do
the
not.
city. So it's the individual homeowners that own those trees. They just happen to be on the city property, and we allow them to plant those trees for the beautification of it. And so I guess in my opinion, it would be their job to take care of them if they planted them.
Well, I guess I look at it differently.
Yeah.
The tree still belongs to the city. City should take care of their own tree, like they do in other cities too,
then we
like
wouldn't-
Kansas City.
Then we wouldn't plant them. If they weren't going to be, if the city did that and wanted to do it, we wouldn't budget for it because that would be something that we wouldn't want to be back trimming on. That's why the individual homeowners, if they like that kind of a situation, I know I don't like them in mine. I happen to have one in the one that I bought. If I had my way, I'd cut it down, but you can't hardly do that either. So anyway, we disagree on that. I just wanted the people to know the other. You kind of made it sound like the city owned those trees,
Well, they
and they
do.
don't.
It's in the city right away.
Well,
Yes,
they're in
it's
the
not
city
on my
right away, but they didn't
private
have to be.
property.
They didn't have to be planted by the owner of the house.
Well, let's
Yeah, go ahead.
remember too also, Councilman Rolfing, that the city does promote to the residents that we would like to have them plant trees in those boulevards. So I'm not saying whether or not that makes those our trees or not, but a couple years ago we had an issue where when we were building a residential street, the contractor came in and grinded some of the trees to a point that they were going to be killed. And I want to thank Dwayne and his staff for coming in on that one.
Yep.
I remember the residents coming and discussing that, and we ended up replacing, the city ended up replacing a large number of trees in about a 3-block area.
Yep, I remember
And
that.
but that's an extreme.
Yeah.
You know, it was a mistake that was made, and, you know, those are some of the things that can happen when, you know, we're doing new construction.
Okay. Anything else? Yes, Councilor Jameson.
Thank you. The $31,000 annually that you spend seems, does that cover one person's payroll? Or portion of their payroll, I suppose?
Yeah, it's basically wages
Wages.
is what the $31,000 covers.
And if a homeowner gets a letter that says that they've got a problem and they don't do anything and the city has to come back and cut it, they'll get billed for that by the
Right.
private contractor. They won't. It's not a part of the 31. The other couple questions, if I could, the 3,700 letters that you send out every year, it seems like a lot. And how many homes are in some of these quadrants?
Well, the 3,700 that we sent out in 2014 was about 32% of the properties that we surveyed.
Oh, okay.
So there was 11,600 properties that we surveyed that year, and only 3,700 of those properties got a letter. So 68% of the people in that forestry district were not impacted by Project Trim at all. They never received notice because their trees were all in compliance or they didn't have any trees.
The only other thing I would add is, just as a suggestion and thought, is that certainly we have, whenever you're out doing this, it seems to be when people get the notices and they don't know what's going on because it just says they have a tree and they're out there looking for which one it is. They don't know which one it is. They don't have the tools to measure it. $31,000 annually for a project like this, maybe, just in all fairness, maybe we should enhance that service and notification process to include identification of the branch or the tree so that the customer is served better. I just think $31,000 is pretty affordable, and that's good. But I think just for a little bit more money, maybe we could just provide a better service to the public. But I'm just throwing that out. I know you've had lots of people inform you how maybe you could do things better. But I just want to throw that as an idea because it just seems so affordable. That's just a comment.
How about if they have a paintball gun and they just shoot it at the tree and hopefully hit
Support
the
that. I support that.
mark it some way? It would increase the time, I'm sure, dramatically if they got out and had to mark every one of the trees that was needed. And I was even thinking along with Councilor Anderson that if they had a 12-foot or a 16-foot mark that they could go up with a spray can and, and put a little mark on the tree where it needed to be above that line would be very helpful. But again, that would, I'm sure, more than double the time that person from 3 days to probably 6 or 8 days, maybe even longer, by identifying and then marking each one of those trees. So, anyway, yeah.
If I could, if it would please the committee, I would ask Kelby to just analyze that for a minute. Go back and work with, tell us what it might take to enhance the service, just one more notch. Like something like that with a marking, guys walking down the street, I don't know that would be good, but maybe one step further in a better process. I mean, we're talking 10 grand, 30 grand, whatever. I think that'd be something for us to consider. I mean, if I'm gathering on, certainly I remember from the past, whenever you guys are out trimming, the phone rings for us too, like it probably does for you. So we could maybe eliminate that phone ringing, save you time and hassles, and as well improve the process. Maybe we're all winners. So anyway.
That's a good idea. Could you send me an email and I'll get that out and we'll decide to the committee members and then we'll decide whether we want to have you back and discuss that a little bit farther. But if you could do that analysis, that would be great.
Absolutely.
And work with Mr. Bixler on that, if you would.
Sure. We can do that.
Appreciate it much. Appreciate it. It's a good idea. Any other questions? Thank you very much, Kelby.
Thank you for your time.
Next on the agenda is a little more TIF discussion from Brenda O'Neill and our esteemed David Bixler.
Well, thank you for having us back again. Brent O'Neill again. We were here in March and are really back to follow up on some of the comments and requests that the council gave us on our TIF process in general and some of the communication and documents that we have there. So I guess what I'd envision, if it suits the council, would be just to follow up with you on those handful of requests, tell you what progress we've made, and then any further dialogue, if you'd like to dive down that path, be happy to do as well. Probably start, Dave's bringing a doc up right now, and it's one that him and I worked on quite extensively, and Dave needs a lot of credit for the work that went into this too, but it's kind of a twofold deal. The first is just a desire to, when we're reporting on any given TIF proposal in front of the council, to have some sort of consistent document, almost a dashboard into the high-level points of the TIF. And so that's what this is, and then kind of part two of it, and I can kind of explain some of that. Part two of that is some specific things that we heard that the council felt should be in here. So with that, Dave, maybe I could start at the top and just kind of walk through what this is. The first is really to give you, let me paraphrase or come back a second. This is TIF 16. You're actually going to be looking at it tonight, so we felt this was kind of a good trial to do it on, and it's probably still a bit of a work in progress. But this is kind of what we have, and the document that's uploaded for the 7 o'clock meeting actually has about a half a page to a page of narrative, and then kind of a dashboard after that. So on this dashboard, you know, the high-level project details, what's the total investment in the project, what's the TIF request, what are the financing costs associated with TIF. The next piece, you know, listing all the parcels and the ownership of any of those in the TIF district. At the bottom of this page, then just kind of shows, again, very high level, the mechanical piece of how the numbers of TIF work. These numbers probably sound familiar from last week, but you know, what's the current base value of the district? What's the current taxes? What's the value after the project happens? What's the projected property taxes after the project happens? And then what's the increment that really is the driving force of any tax increment district? Which gets us to page 2. Which again shows a couple of the mechanics. So I'll start with, maybe I'm gonna start on the right since we're fresh on that 271,000. This just shows, based on our projection, the amount of increment in any given year in the TIF. And then at the bottom, could you go down to the bottom for a second, Dave? This shows the 4 taxing entities and basically what their share of this TIF hypothetically is while the TIF is in place, and then also the value in taxes that this property brings to each of those entities when the district's complete. And then back on the left is just an exhaustive list of all the eligible costs that are included, and you're always going to see the eligible costs at or in excess of the amount of TIF requested. So that's kind of it on the dashboard. I'd be curious, I can jump into a couple of the other things that council requested or get your feedback at this point on what you think of this.
Feedback? Yeah, Councilor Jamison?
Brent, on the annual increment for TIF payment, the 271,000, that's then in, like, say, 2018, that's the new taxable rate? That's the tax that would be assessed on that?
Correct.
And I would think that over the years, though, that would escalate.
It would, and that's a great question, and we've really taken 2 approaches with that in the past. The one is to build in an escalator, typically 1.5% to 2%, and other times we've left it flat. And I think the escalator is probably a little more accurate. The keeping it flat is more conservative, and so it just, I don't really think there's a right or wrong way to do it. They're 2 different methods. This one is probably just a little bit safer as far as the numbers playing out the way.
So you wouldn't be relying on getting to 280. You wouldn't set that up as a part of your formula. If it should get there, when it gets there, it just pays off the TIF faster.
Right.
Okay, good.
Yeah, that was it. As the taxes would increase on that new piece of property, the 271 should go up, therefore paying off the TIF earlier.
Yep. We always hope for that.
Yep. Questions over here on this side? Do you have, and I remember that too, you do have on the application itself kind of a checklist of things that need to be included, and that gives the eligibility, if you will, of the expenses here, the things that make this a TIF eligible project. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So by having that and this kind of, I'm going to call it an executive summary, if you will, of the TIF, should give us then a good way to look at it as to whether or not it meets the criteria that we have, and or if it does not for one reason or another, if people want to bring that forward.
Yeah, and the real goal was, all this information you've always received. Sometimes it comes out in the presentation, sometimes it comes out in the report. This was a way for you, exactly like you said, Councilor Rolfing, to gather or to view that without having to dive in. It's there for you.
Because we had one that's coming through, and I know it's about 30-some pages long, and it takes a while to go through that.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. How about the wording on the application itself? Did we get that put in?
Sure.
You know, because we're kind of in a draft mode, rather than actually include it on our application, I simply brought a statement with that I just show you the statement, and if it meets the council's approval, we'll just go ahead and add it.
Will this part be part of the information then that comes to us? The snapshot or the
Oh, yes,
executive
yes.
summary?
It's our intent that's standard operating going forward.
Tax incremental financial final application.
And get rid of the shall.
Clarity. Questions?
Not a question. I just said, you heard me, Brent.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
something that we have spoken with the city attorney about, the shall and will. So maybe changing that to will per advice of legal after incremental financing. Second line. That's all.
An individual seeking tax incremental finance shall file an application.
Remember our conversation on Friday?
Yeah, I do, but
Changing that over.
that one, this one is one that the applicant can do if they want, is what we're trying to say here. Not that we will do something there.
Well,
Am I
any
reading that
developer,
wrong?
organization, or individual seeking tax incremental finance named will file an application with the Community Development Department per city ordinance.
See, but they don't have to.
Yeah, I can speak that just a little bit, if I may. I think the first thing I'd say is this is probably one thing that we want to just get a final legal blessing on. You know, if we take shall out, that's probably safer, but shall and may, I know are two words in the legal world that are very important that they're used in the right places. And I'm, you know, just off the cuff would be very happy, especially I see it up there twice. The first time, part of the reason we used it there was we were either paraphrasing or darn near quoting what the ordinance does say about how to file. But again, in kind of a non-legal document, it might make more sense to word that a little differently. And then the other, again, would want to work with legal on that, but just wanted, again, largely to the point made last month, you know, make it crystal clear that process remains in place for any applicant.
Right.
Yep.
So you're going to run this by legal and then get it as part of the application after what kind of date?
Oh, well, if we get it done tomorrow. I mean,
Okay.
there's no, yeah.
Yes. Counselor Jameson?
I'd sure like to review this a little longer than to have them send it on that way. I mean, for instance, there's no talk here, and I don't know, I'm sure it's somewhere else in the ordinance about timelines. And if the application is received, how long does the staff have to respond? How long does the staff have to recommend approval or denial? And then from where can the applicant go on to the city council without delay?
Sure. Sure.
As well, and just one other thing is when you make the recommendation, if staff recommendation shall not affect any applicant's right to have the TIF proposal go through the TIF approval process. Anyway, I'd like a little more time to review it other than just to have you go and get legal approval, at least for me. And just so a couple thoughts about the timeline isn't laid out here, but it's maybe laid out somewhere else.
Yeah, and maybe I can start by seeing, this is a document we showed you last week. We actually kind of envision, I think we want to refine this a little bit, but kind of a page 2 of the application, and that kind of spells out the timeline. And then I'd also envision whatever statement we settle on, ultimately, whether at the beginning or the end of this document is really present there.
You call that a timeline for council notification within 1 week after the applicant has put in their application? Because then we're notified that the process has started.
Yeah, well, I'm reading it. I mean, yeah, that's good that we get that notification. The other would be, how long does the staff have to review it before they make a recommendation or denial?
Sure.
What would be the process for the individual to go on to the planning commission knowing that they've been denied? Just a timeliness that, maybe it's here, I just need to read through it, but those are my concerns.
Sure. No, they're good concerns. At least to answer one of the questions, when our recommendation, really, if you look at that series of items, the planning commission hearing is really the first time we put an official recommendation in writing, and largely and almost unequivocally it stays the same between the planning commission and the city council. So really, roughly a few weeks before the council would see it, when we're actually going to the planning commission, that's where we'd have a recommendation out there.
So, if I may, so this is similar to what, like, a zoning issue is, that it goes to planning. Planning, I don't believe even sends out a notification to the council at that time, but then it goes to the planning commission with or without planning's recommendation. So this is pretty much similar to the same process as we do when we rezone different plots of land around the city also.
Exactly. It'll go through that same type of process of here, straight to the planning commission, from planning commission within, what is it, two meetings or one meeting, the next meeting it has to come to us, something like that?
Yeah. I mean, our goal is, the first available meeting after the planning commission.
Yeah. And with that executive summary coming out, as soon as it's ready to go to the planning commission, we should have time to review it also then.
Yeah, and really going forward, I would like to see that dashboard done as part of the report to the planning commission.
Yes.
So it is out there for a period of time.
Everybody, right.
Yeah.
You have more? No, go ahead.
If I could go back to the other schedule you had with the costs. Second page. The platting fees, closing cost, landscape buffer, every one of those, some of them probably are predetermined based on some basic math, but other things like building retaining walls, removing debris, storm drain, let's say landscape buffer. How do you check these numbers?
Sure. We can kind of use a couple different methods. In this case, like retaining walls, for example, are based on some discussions and documentation that the contractors have had with the developers here. So that's really an estimate at this point. It's not a bid. When we put these together, Councilor Jamison, one of the things we're looking at is accuracy, of course, but also an understanding that there's a validation period after the fact, and the agreement for this particular one is set up such as that we put all of these expenses in. These really become a ceiling, and the total dollar amount at the bottom is $4 million roughly. That is kind of a ceiling. We're only going to approve. I hope you approve tonight, $2.8 million. But these line items then will have to be verified before they actually become reimbursable. So we will ask for a invoice, let's just say on the retaining walls, and if it's $500,000, that reduces the amount that can be reimbursed.
Good. One other thing that popped in my head looking at this again is, so let's take that 3.987. Is that the amount of the TIF request tonight?
No, the amount of the request is $2.8 million.
So if you take the 2.8 million and you take the increment amount, I guess what I'm trying to do is work this backwards. So if you were trying to finance that 2.8 million, because that's the gap, right? So you take that increment, which is going to be what, 271?
Could you? I'm sorry. Could you rephrase that?
To finance that 2.8 million, what dollars?
Yes, the 271.
Okay, so if you take 271,000 a year times the what, 10 years,
It's going to be a little longer than that.
20 years, or what?
It's going to be probably 15 to 17.
Is that how you work it backwards? And you determine that you cannot finance more than the 2.8 or something because,
Well, it's kind of twofold. It is, there's certainly different things that put limits on what TIF can be used for. If there was not really any extraordinary need here, my gut tells me that the council might not support it. It's because there are needs here that you would. And so those costs become, one of the things that sort of allow you to fund TIF to a certain level. Another is the actual gap in the project, which is roughly $2.8 million. And then the third thing, again, a limiting factor on what you can do with TIF is how, like you said, Councilor Jameson, sort of work in the financial financing piece. And so that becomes a limiting factor as well. So I guess if I could add to that, if you go any one of those three, once you hit your limit, really becomes the limit for it all.
The 2.8.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't, if I could, anybody else, why wouldn't we take, and maybe this is something you do, take the 271 and you're figuring at 5%, I'm assuming here, and the 271 will support a payment or a payment, annual payment on X number of, at 5% of X number of dollars that they could go out and loan and borrow. Is that kind of the way you do it too?
A little bit, and I've got it in our actual TIF plan, because we showed what the actual increment would be over the years, and then the developer, showed us, and we included it in the plan, if you did a level repayment, what that would be. And do you mind showing that, Dean? So this, what you see up top is kind of a regurgitation of what is in the new dashboard. If you look at the bottom, then this is kind of how the developer ran just a projection of debt service. And you can see, because it's level, it's actually slightly less than the 271, but that's what a level debt service plan would look like through 2032. Oh, yes, thanks for pointing out that column, Dave.
Okay. Yeah.
speaking of the 100% completion, what if the project goes, I know we're analyzing this one and it's good exercise for us, but still, what if the project, starts and they get 50, 60% of it going? Clearly, increment wouldn't be up to the 271.
Yeah.
But would that then impact the, the term isn't going to change, the contract isn't going to change. Right. If it only generates 150, yeah, that's all the guy's got to work with, right?
Right. That, in that case, and it's, TIF 5, excluding TIF 5 from that point forward, the city has set up all of its agreements with developers on a developer at risk sort of basis. So, to that point, if it was 150,000 versus 270, that's really developer risk. There are times, where banks are conscious of that, and there's, even personal guarantees or, some sort of a subsequent collateral that they look for. But from the city standpoint, we're really off the hook if that's how it turns out.
Anything from this side? Okay, how to proceed then? You'll get back to us with how this is going to be more implemented, the wording, after the attorney has looked at it, and you will, do you want them to come back and go through that, or do you want to just get notice that it's been approved by the attorney and that this process is continuing in this manner?
I was daydreaming a little bit, thinking of other things about this issue, but if I could just, email me that paragraph, maybe, and let me think for a minute, and then.
Sure.
Then I'd just pass on to you and say,
Okay.
you know, here's my thoughts, if I could.
And then get it by the city attorney's office to make sure that it's in compliance with what he thinks it needs to sound like. And then with this executive summary, I call it, we should be, I think, in better shape going forward.
Yeah, I feel good.
Yeah, that takes a bit of the pressure off of you,
Yeah,
puts it more on us, and but we're still going to rely very heavily on what your
Yeah.
recommendations
Happy to be
are
there.
and reasons for either acceptance or rejection, support or non-support,
okay.
which we should. Anything else over here?
Yeah, I think after we see what changes, we may decide to have it brought back here
Yeah.
again, so. yeah.
Right, we can always have you come back.
Would it make sense, you know, maybe we just sit back for a few days and, you know, if you have a chance to digest it and any feedback, maybe then Dave and I can just connect again.
Yep,
And then I'll go to other Dave and make sure attorneys are fine and maybe something like that would work.
yep. Yes,
Do I understand it that one of the changes would be that the council would be notified once an application has been received within a week? The council will be notified. That'll become a part of the ordinance?
We wouldn't recommend an ordinance change on that. You know, we did the ordinance change probably late 2013, and one of the things we committed to as a operating procedure was within 7 days of any app coming in that we would send a note of some sort to the council. The real intent in that case was just to put it on your radar at the front end of the process, and certainly a lot of details come together after that, but the real intent was that within 7 days you'd be on alert that it was out there.
Right, I mean, one of the underlying issues that we've been dealing with is that we haven't really discussed is the idea that there's people coming to see you and others about a TIF, and not just you, but the mayor as well, and getting kind of a thumbs up, thumbs down behind the scenes. The developer feels, well, I can't fight that, so I'm not going to do anything. That's one of the key things that we need to figure out how to fix.
but Councilor James, isn't that done with the wording on that, on the application itself, saying basically whether planning, whether, Brent and his office gives a thumbs up or thumbs down, you have the right to move forward with this by doing the application and moving, and we'll take it and that's exactly what we're trying to do there.
Well, then maybe I'll reconsider what was said in that paragraph to make sure it highlights that those individuals who have been given the thumbs down in a private meeting, here's the process you follow if you want to do the application. But I'll rethink that.
Yep, that was the thought on that. Yes.
Yeah, and actually on that note, I'll make sure I realize now that you don't have that in front of you. We were just doing it on the board, but we'll make sure you get a copy too that you can look at.
Great, thanks, that'll help.
Super. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Appreciate
you're
it.
welcome. It's been good. Thank you.
Any open discussion? I hear none, then I will adjourn the meeting.